Nope, not that. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Samuel. Technically, I'm reading 2nd Samuel, but as I've said many a times already, and I am glowing here, so I'm going to turn this down a bit. This one like that. Okay, this one's on way too high. There you go. As I've said many a times, I tend to view that 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book, as well as you really should. So I will just keep referring to it as the Book of Samuel, but I am beginning 2nd Samuel chapter 1. So we're going to start our reading today. I encourage you guys to follow along as I start 2nd Samuel today. And as you guys flip to it, I guess I'm going to just open us up with a word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, you would show us more of who you are and your desire for our lives. And of course, remind us the importance that only you can be our king, and that we can't really trust in, people, but that is all the more reason we need to follow you and to trust you. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Oh, sorry, man, I just got like, yeah. Anyway, so just do a quick recap of the ending of 1 Samuel. So as I've said many a times, the way 1 Samuel kind of ends is that it ends the tale of one king, right? After all, the main premise of both 1st and 2nd Samuel is the idea that no human king can truly lead the people, right? Only God can do that. And so, now I know some people might have objections to this notion, because the idea of like, well, of course you're going to tell this narrative of only God can be king by having two bad kings. But the fact of the matter is that it really doesn't matter, right? Because, of course, when we get to David, David is, some people think he's a good king, and he is in some ways, right? He's definitely he has good leadership skills, but at the same time, David has some personal moral failings, which is what would disqualify him as being a good king. And then, of course, we had Saul, who dies at the end of 1 Samuel, and he's kind of shows bad leadership qualities, right? And so it's kind of these two extremes that is shown through Saul and David. And so 1 Samuel ends the tale of Saul. So Saul, the first king of Israel, he dies basically at the end of 1 Samuel. But of course you wonder, why is the book even called the Book of Samuel when the prophet is dead before Saul is, right? But of course, once again, the nucleus of the Book of Samuel is the revelation that God gave to Samuel, right? That humanity has rejected God as their king, and that is going to lead to bad things, basically, right? And so, with Saul dead, we're going to move on, not right away, of course, but we're going to move on to our second king, the person that the 1 Samuel's kind of hyped up, right? We've hyped up David, as the next king of Israel. Now, of course, I kind of already gave you a spoiler that he is going to drop the ball. But as we go through 2 Samuel, we see the evolution of that, right? That he too, similar to Saul, David will rise up and he will, he'll hit a high point. But of course, as the old saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? And so that too will happen, but we will see the evolution of that throughout the story. Now, for some details within the last couple of chapters of 1 Samuel, what happened was that after a couple of years of Saul chasing David around, because Saul tries to kill the guy because he doesn't want David to become the next king. David decides to hide among the Philistines in a place called Gath. And he lives there for a while. And then eventually the Philistines go to war with Israel, as they do. And then in this battle, this epic battle, Saul and his sons all die there. They all die. And it has that somber note as, his life comes to an end and he died. He basically commits seppuku to save himself embarrassment, right? And so that's how 1 Samuel ends. Now, we move on to 2 Samuel, where now we go back to David's side of the story, and David will learn of what just happened with Saul, at least somewhat. So here we go. 2 Samuel, chapter 1. So after the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites, and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. And on the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid him homage. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. And the messenger responded, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "Well, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear, with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then Saul said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and have brought them here to my lord." Then David and all the men who were with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Now David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. And David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Strike him down." So his man struck him down, and the Amalekite died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your head. Your own mouth testifies against you, and when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Now David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan. And he ordered that all the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. A gazelle, lie slain on your heights, O Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, and proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. O Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. Oh, how the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother, and you were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. So that's chapter 1. Now, chapter 1 is pretty straightforward, but it's kind of a weird way for the story to start. I can also see where some people would naturally divide 1st and 2nd Samuel, because some people would think that there's a discrepancy in the writers here, where at the end of 1st Samuel, we have a certain account of how Saul dies. And then here, the account is a little bit different. But there's probably a good explanation for it. So, if you remember back in the ending of 1st Samuel, how Saul dies is that he basically commits seppuku. Because Saul tried to have his armor bearer kill him instead. So there's the whole thing like, oh, you know, thrust me with your sword, or else these uncircumcised Philistines will thrust me and embarrass me, you know, in the city or whatever, right? Which, yes, that is obviously a wordplay. And then, of course, the armor bearer refuses. He refuses to kill Saul. So Saul's like, all right, fine, I have to, take it in my own hands, quite literally. And he takes his sword and stabs himself with it, basically. And Saul dies. So that's how he dies in 1 Samuel. Now in 2 Samuel, we have this report of this Amalekite who said that he is the one that actually killed Saul. Now, of course, the simple explanation of why there's this discrepancy is that maybe this guy was trying to get favor with David, right? Because, you know, this Amalekite slave, he would have known about, you know, David and Saul's, you know, rivalry, that they were enemies. And so, think of it like this. The logic that this guy is having, the messenger, would be that if I tell, you know, Saul, one of Saul's enemies, that I was the one who killed him, then I might get a special honor, right? I might be viewed as like, yeah, you know, like, among Saul's enemies, I'm special among them because I actually killed Saul. That may be what the guy was thinking. So he might have thought that there was some honor or glory in it, right? But David obviously turns the tables on this guy, right? And David's like, no, you should not have struck the Lord's anointed, because that's kind of David's conviction about Saul, right? That he, even though they're enemies, David would refuse to raise a sword against him. And so David has the Amalekite executed, right? Because of his reverence for Saul. And of course, what's interesting about the beginning of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel is that it really shows how much David reveres Saul, right? That he writes this song and he says nothing but good things about him, right? You know, about how he was as strong a warrior as he was, and how nice he was to the women, kind of thing, right? And Saul is like this role model human being. I mean, arguably, right? Of course, we see through First Samuel that Saul does kind of have this descent of madness, right? But you know, David cares more about who Saul was before that, right? The good guy Saul used to be. And I mean, that's the way that we generally look at historical figures, right? We try for the most part to always look at their better qualities and praise those things, right? And so David is no different. He does this with Saul and praises him for the man he used to be, right? And so that's how David kind of writes this song, right? Quote unquote song. I mean, I assume it is. I just won't be able to sing because apparently it exists in some document that no longer exists. This Book of Jashar, if you're wondering what that is. I'm sure there must be some kind of records, but no one really knows, right? As there were a lot of ancient documents that were lost. And of course, we have to remember that, like, a lot of the Bible that we have is stuff that was maintained from after, like, you know, Israel's downfall and all that, you know, sometime after, you know, David, right? Like, a couple centuries later. But anyway, David writes a song for Saul about how great he used to be. And then, of course, he also says about how great his friend Jonathan was, right? And how much that, you know, he loved Jonathan, right? As if, like, they were the best of buddies, right? Now, there is this funny part in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And there's been many a talk about it. Because it's a very, very weird thing to find, right? Especially in the Bible of all places, right? And this is a line where David sings in a song about how Jonathan, you know, your love was greater than the love of women. And there's been many a talk about this particular verse. And not just this one, but a couple other ones that involve David and Jonathan. And the theory that David and Jonathan were gay. Might as well bring it up now. So there's this theory that they were gay because there were some moments where, like, there's this part where people thought that, like, Jonathan stripped down in front of David and gave him, like, his clothes. So he, like, they're basically, like, you know, being naked with each other. So there was that moment back in, like, chapter 17 or 18 or whatever in 1 Samuel. And then, of course, there's this line in 2 Samuel about how Jonathan, you know, the love from Jonathan was greater than the love of women. Now, a lot of people, you know, some people read, like, in between the lines and kind of thought that that was the case. But as I've mentioned, you know, several streams ago, when I talked about the Jonathan taking off his tunic and stuff for David, that was more as a ceremonial thing, right? Because the funny thing is that, like, and I mentioned it in that video too, where it wasn't exclusively a Jewish thing. Many cultures actually did this, right? Where a man would strip down for another man and give him his stuff, right? As a symbol of, like, succession, right? Which, once again, when we read in the context of David and Jonathan somehow, I guess, knows that David is going to be the future king, right? That he's or you could think of it this way: Jonathan saw in David the leader Israel needed. And so he was willing to give up his position as the heir to the throne so that Israel would benefit and would have the leader it needs, right? That's kind of that could have been what Jonathan was thinking, right? And it's a ceremonial thing. It's not necessarily like, two guys stripping down for each other for some, man to man action. You know what I mean, right? But it wasn't that, right? And then of course we jump here to 2 Samuel, and then David has this line, and some people would think, well, he maybe like David was gay, and he thought that like, well, the love of a man was more important than the love of a woman, kind of thing, right? And so that is why David said it. That's what the I've heard many people talk about this passage in that way, but you know what? The funny thing is, on the one hand, I want to clear this up, but on the other hand, it's actually like, I don't know if I should say this because it's actually kind of worse. Because, and this one, I was kind of making, as I referenced like a couple minutes ago, that this passage is very weird. Why the Bible even has this in it, right? But I guess, the Bible doesn't care about being perfect, right? The writers are very honest about it. But when you read this passage, while a lot of people entertain the David was gay idea, I think this passage is actually a lot more straightforward than that. You don't have to like hypothesize, I guess, that David was gay, because there's a lot of evidence that he wasn't. Right now, of course, there's some, you could argue certain things, but more speculation more than anything. But like, it would be hard to argue that David was gay because he was a womanizer, right? And as another point I'll make throughout 2 Samuel, the reason why David is a bad king is because one big reason he's a bad king is because he's a womanizer, right? That is not a good quality in a leader. So there's that, right? So David was a clear womanizer and kind of an ass about it, right? So it's hard to make the argument that like, well, he was a womanizer, but he was really gay underneath all that, right? That'd be pretty hard to argue well. Like, sure, there's some like TV dramas that like to use that for the sake of drama, right? Where there would be a character who is a bit of a womanizer, but it's because he's secretly misogynistically gay, right? But I don't find that to be the case here. However, if we go with the more simpler explanation of why David says this line, it's actually kind of worse. And I'm about to tell you in a couple minutes, but it's actually kind of worse. And it's one of those funny things in the Bible that the Bible just kind of lets this be there. And it's like, yeah, here it is, right? And then take it or leave it, I guess. So the more accurate way to interpret that line and this song in general, it's gonna sound terrible, but there's an old saying that guys have, it goes bros before, I don't think I need to finish the rest, right? But you know where I'm going with this, right? That's what David probably actually meant. And I mean, it's a common idea among men. It's a man thing, I guess, right? Bros before other things. And so, this like bromance, right? But it's not necessarily a homosexual relationship. It's not that at all. But now that I've said it this way, some people would have wished it was, because the other way of looking at it is actually kind of worse. And it's just always a funny thing to like, I don't know, I always found this passage kind of funny. I remember when I was reading through like this passage and I thought about it. But then of course, like, oh, you don't have to think about it that hard. But then one of the things that like, when it comes to interpreting parts of the Bible, I think the reason why some people over spiritualize things or do some kind of like hermeneutical gymnastics to try and make it say something that it's not real. The Bible say something that it's not really saying. It's because there are moments like these where, let's be real, the Bible does say things that are actually kind of inappropriate. Um, but at the same time, they something that can be admired from that, if you can call it that, is that there's that honesty to it, right? The writer doesn't feel like it has to beat around the bush. It can just tell you something as it is. And so there's passages like this that kind of like, it's one of those funny moments where that's like, that's kind of in a more negative light, because it, I mean, we we obviously view things differently from people back then, right? The idea of, bros before hoes, might as well just say it, bros before hoes, people would have been fine saying, I mean, that statement has been around for years, right? And guys would just say that to each other, right? And basically the bro code was that, you put your bros first, right? And so that was kind of, that's been a thing since like forever, right? And so David and Jonathan are no exception to that rule, right? The bro comes first kind of thing. And that is a more accurate way of reading this passage. I always, like, I guess because a lot of people want to like add on to like to find other things in the Bible that like it doesn't say. And so the David was gay idea was brought out there, and it was a, well, I wouldn't say a popular opinion, but I have heard it quite a bit, and people would refer to this passage about like, oh, David was gay because like his love for Jonathan was greater than that of women. But I think it's the simpler explanation is the bro code thing, and to its extreme though, right? Bros before hoes kind of idea, which is worse if you think about it, but that is a more accurate way of reading it, because of course there's too many instances where obviously David was not gay, right? I mean, his womanizing ways is actually a big problem, right? And it ends up being a big problem for Israel later. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there, because David's philandering does not end, right? I mean, we just started Second Samuel, so there's going to be some philandering. You can be sure about that. Okay, so I have to say about this. There's not much else of the song, really. It's a Bros Before Hoes song, which is funny that the Bible even has such a thing in it. So, alrighty. So, chapter 2. Now, in the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" And the Lord said, "Go up." And David asked, "Well, where should I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. Now David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them, saying, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and fulfillment, may the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor, because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." Meanwhile, Abner, the son of Ner, the commanding officer of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, so 3 different places, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel, so basically everywhere else. Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now Abner, the son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, however you pronounce this guy's name. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool, and one group on the other. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." "All right then, let's do it," Joab said. So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazarim, which means the field of daggers. It's hardcore. Verse 17. The battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. The 3 sons of Zeruiah were there: Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" I didn't give him the right voice. "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or to the left, and take on one of the 2 young men, and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Again, Abner warned Asahel, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look at your brother Joab in the face?" But Asahel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Asahel's stomach, and the spear came through his back. He fell there and died on the spot, and every man stopped when he came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was setting, they came to the hill of Ammah, near Giah, on the way to the wasteland of Gibeon. Then the men of Benjamin rallied behind Abner. They formed themselves into a group and took their stand on top of a hill. Now Abner called out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" And Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuing them until morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the troops came to a halt. They no longer pursued Israel, nor did they fight anymore. All that night, Abner and his men marched through Arabah, and they crossed the Jordan, continued through the morning hours and came to Mahanaim. Then Joab stopped pursuing Abner and assembled the entire army. Besides Asahel, 19 of David's men were found missing, but David's men had killed 360 Benjamites who were with Abner. They took Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night and arrived at Hebron at daybreak. So, awkward moments in chapter 2. So, chapter 2 has this weird start where, like, David is crowned king, but only of, like, excuse me, of one of the tribes, right? So, obviously, Israel's not all that united at this point, right? I mean, to be fair, they did kind of crumble under, like, Saul's not so good leadership, right? At least toward the end of his life, his leadership was kind of weak. But David is crowned king. But of course, Abner decides to have someone from the house of Saul, right? So Saul's son, Ishbosheth, or whatever his name is crowned king, right? And so Abner just has him, crowned as king. And, this obviously ends up being a problem because now you have two kings in the land of Israel, right? And so naturally, they're going to fight to consolidate power. And, sure, David ends up winning it, but, in chapter 2, we read of one of the tragedies of war, right? So, Abner is pursued. Abner is he's the general for Saul's son. And he's being pursued by a guy named Asahel. Now, of course, Abner recognizes him and he knows him as his friend Joab's younger brother or something like that, right? I think that's their relationship. I don't know why I'm feeling really sleepy right now. But anyway, that's why I'm like rubbing my eyes continuously. But anyway, so Abner, it's kind of this sad moment, right? Because there's this part where Asahel's chasing Abner around, and Abner's like, "Hey, man, like just give this up, right? Don't chase me around like this, or you'll force my hand and I'll kill you." But at the same time, I really don't want to kill you because, your brother and I are like good friends, right? And so there's that like awkward moment, right? Of course, Asahel doesn't, he doesn't relent, and so Abner, he tries to incapacitate him, but fails at it. I mean, to be fair though, I mean even the butt end of a spear can be pretty deadly, right? Because I mean it is a wooden shaft, so if a person gets run through it, that it could puncture, right? And so, Abner just ends up stabbing him with the non-bladed end, which in a way is kind of worse because, with the bladed end it would be a clean cut, right? And then you would just get a quick kill that way. But to get impaled by the other end of the spear, that's got to be like mega painful, right? Because the wood would like have to puncture through everything, and it doesn't just cut through cleanly. That's gotta like hurt like mad, right? That's gotta suck. But that's how Asahel dies, right? Because he gets basically impaled by the back end of a spear. And Abner was just like, "Yo, man, let's just like give this up. Like, there's no need to fight each other." And it's one of those things that like there is some wisdom in just like stop it, right? To relent and not be so bloodthirsty. But like, because I don't know what Azahel's deal was, right? But anyway, not much else to say. And then of course there is that moment where like Joab and Abner, they meet, and Abner's just like, come on, can't this just stop, right? Which is weird because, like, one of the things that, like, is important to observe is that, like, David's, not just David, which I have pointed this out as, like, part of his, like, character flaw, but it obviously, like, is a big deal because it kind of, like, like, spreads out to his followers as well, right? So David has a little bit of a bloodlust problem, right? We've read in other parts where, like, David likes to fight. I mean, he's good at it, so that might be one reason to like it. But, oh, excuse me. But David is, like, pretty bloodthirsty, right? Or at least he seems that way. And now it's kind of translated to his guys, right? Like, Asahel, who was following David around, at least for some time, he too has his, like, unsated bloodlust. Is like, that's not good, right? And of course, like, we see in Azahel's case that this ends up getting him killed, right? And so when you think of it like that, there might be some foreboding. It might be a little foreboding to think, right? And I think this is obviously, the drama of it is obviously intentional to, have people wonder, well, will David kind of meet a similar end, right? Because of his bloodlust. Because we see, like, one of David's men who has bloodlust of his own, it ends up getting him killed, right? And so this is an interesting thing when you have to, like, analyze David's character throughout 2nd Samuel, right? And the kind of impact he makes on people, right? Of course, it's one of those ironic things where well, I don't discourage it because obviously there's good things about David's leadership we can learn from. But David is actually a model, like, how to understand the influence of leaders, right? But of course, you gotta take the good and the bad, right? Because it's easy for us to talk about, like, the good things about David's characteristics that are good leadership qualities, right? David's trust in the Lord, David's steadfastness, his convictions, right? And his courage to stand up for his convictions, right? Those are all admirable things that, we can draw from a leader. And the kind of things we should, draw from leaders in our own lives. But of course, when you look at the story of David, you have to take both sides, right? That there is a danger to leadership, right? And of course, this is where we would give the practical wisdom to people about, like, well, be careful about, like, how much you idolize someone, right? And how much on a pedestal you may put someone else, because that does influence how you live, right? The people you look up to as role models, the leaders in your life, obviously impact the way you live. And so this is definitely true here, and David is an interesting model case of, like, understanding both good and bad leadership qualities that David, um, I guess, spreads out, that he gives off to his men, right? And his men aspire to him. And so it's just an interesting thing to read this little story. And it's one of those things, too, where, like, why does the Bible feel the need? Like, if we're just going to talk about, like, David being king in 2nd Samuel, you would just jump from event to event about David's life as king, right? But there's these interesting little stories of, like, people that have nothing to seem to do with anything, right? Like, Asahel has basically no business, being here. But his role in the story is a reminder about, like, how we learn from our leaders, and you got to be wise about what you pick up from your leaders, right? Because Asahel was not one such person, right? Sure, he may picked up the good quality of loyalty, which Asahel clearly had, but Asahel also picked up some picked up on probably some of David's more battle-hungry, mindset, that it ends up blinding him, right? Because then Asahel ends up doing stupid decisions and not listening to Abner, right? It's gonna be a shorter stream from the sounds of it, because I can already feel myself like, you know what I mean? So we'll just read a couple more chapters. I'll probably just read up to like chapter 4 or something. I think it's a good chapter 4 is a good place to stop actually. So we'll just read 2 more chapters, which will only take like just over half an hour. All right, chapter 3. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Now David grew stronger and stronger, and Saul, the house of Saul, grew weaker and weaker. Now sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. Oh, we got one of these going on. Okay, we got genealogy things, so I have to really pay attention to this. The second was Kileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And yes, the Bible has to say that every time about her. Third, the Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth of Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And sixth, Ishram, son of David's wife Eglah. And these were born to David in Hebron. Verse 6. Now during the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth said, so he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David, and now you accuse me of an offense of involving this woman? May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Now Ishbosheth did not dare to say another word to Abner, because he was afraid of him. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, "Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." I realized I didn't do a voice this whole time. "Good," said David. "I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, "Give my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." Yeah, because remember that was a thing? So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel, the son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Bahurim? Then Abner said to him, "Go back home." So he went back, and we never heard from him again. Now Abner conferred with the elders of Israel and said, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it, for the Lord promised David, 'By my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of their enemies.'" Now Abner also spoke to the Benjamites in Parson. Then he went to Hebron to tell David everything that Israel and the whole tribe of Benjamin wanted to do. When Abner, who had 20 men behind him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant. So they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and Abner went in peace. Oh, we're gonna make it through this. I'm like fading pretty quickly. Anyway, verse 22, because chapter 3 is pretty long. Just as David's men and Joab returned from a raid that brought with them a great deal of plunder, but Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away, and he went in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner, the son of Ner, had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went up to the king and said, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you, and observe your movements, and find out everything you are doing." Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah, but David did not know it. Oh, excuse me. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber, as if to speak to him privately. And then there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Oof, Abner be dead now. Later, when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner the son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Oof. Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the field of Gibeah. In the battle of Gibeon. Yeah, you know that we just read last chapter. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth, and walk in mourning in front of Abner." King David himself walked behind the bier, and they buried Abner in Hebron. And the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb. All the people wept also. The king sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked. And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely. Oh, excuse me. If I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets." So I guess he's going all day without food. That's gonna be pretty tough, because I mean, if you're a warrior in that time, you have to eat a lot, right? Because I mean, it's taxing on the body. As you can see, it's taxing with me right now. Not that I'm hungry, it's more like I'm just sleepy. I don't know why I feel so sleepy right now. I can like see on OBS that like I have those huge eye bags down here. Means I gotta go sleep. But anyway, we're gonna finish this first. I'm gonna try and power through this. Verse 35. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, May God deal with me, ever be it severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets, which I just read. Now all the people took note and were pleased. Everyone and everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people there and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, the son of Ner. Then the king said to his men, Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel today? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds. Man, chapter 3 is pretty long there. That is a good question. So chapter 3, bunch of sequence of events, really. There's not a lot to say about it. So basically, David and Abner tries to have a peace agreement with David, right? Because, if Abner has been a commander for Saul, right? He's been like a general in Saul's army for years. He's obviously seen a lot of battles, and he's probably seen a lot of bloodshed, right? Which is interesting because, of course, it's the old saying, right? It's those who have seen death know how to value life. And Abner is one such person, and we saw this in chapter 2 as well. That Abner, he didn't want to kill Asahel because, Abner's probably like old and tired, right? He's like, look, I've seen enough bloodshed, kind of thing. I don't want to just have this fighting continue. And so we get to chapter 3, and Abner is trying to have peace with David, right? Because Abner doesn't want to see any more fighting, and I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? It's like we don't want to see the fighting. We just want to wish that, like, people could just have peace with each other. And so Abner tries to set up peace with David, but ultimately it fails because, of course, not to David's fault, but the fault of, his guys, including Joab. Joab just, the first thing he thinks is to take revenge, right? Now, of course, that's a pretty common thing in the ancient world, and that's a reason why the Bible tries to, like, dissuade people from just, like, going on revenge hunts, because it's just generally not helpful. But Abner's thing fails because, of course, he's assassinated by Joab, right? And Joab kind of really screws over everybody in his, like, desire for revenge. And so, first of all, Joab pisses off David, right? Joab just pisses off David, right? By killing Abner, because David was ready to set up peace with Abner. And, maybe there'd be a peaceful resolution to this conflict, but it appears it is not going to be that easy. Now, a more observational thing, which just kind of like, as I mentioned before, one of David's big problems is that he's a womanizer, right? Like, his whole shtick is that he can't keep his plunger in his pants. So anyway, in the beginning of chapter 3, it's actually kind of funny where it does this whole thing of talking about all the like while he was fighting this war with Abner, he's I guess David had enough time, to get busy. You know what I mean? It's funny how like chapter 3 begins with, well, David's army only got stronger, and Abner's like the house of Saul only got weaker, and it shows that like David, yeah, he obviously did get a lot of power because he had enough power to have free time, right? And look at this guy, right? Like he has like 6 sons with 6 different women. Like I know we all give Jacob shit for like having 6 kids with one woman while having, other kids with other women, but like, dang, David here is just like, I guess there is enough of him to go around, right? And this is only during this time, right? This is early in David's kingship, right? Because we'll find out much later in the story that David's going to have a whole bunch of other kids. So we can assume with the 6 women that he has here, he's going to have more kids with them. And who knows how many more wives he's going to pick up, because David has quite a number of them, right? I mean, he already had 2 for like a while. And then he picks up some more, right? He's got like 6 women here. Each of them give him a son, at least at this point in time. And then, of course, this is where like if as we read the Bible more honestly, it's just like, yeah, David's actually he's kind of a bad king, right? Because what kind of king needs to do what he does? And that's when Abner tries to set up this peace agreement, right? And David gives Abner this ridiculous condition. He's like, I'll only see you again if you bring me my first wife. So that would mean that David would have 7 wives, right? Because he's got the 6 that he's had kids with all this time. And then he wants his first wife, right? Who Abner is like, well, Saul married her off to someone else because you were gone, right? So David's like, no, I want my first wife too. I gotta have more women, right? I gotta have more women in my harem. And so, like, it just makes David look really bad, actually, right? Because clearly not thinking with the right head here. But he goes to this trouble, and there's this guy here. What's his name? Patil or Paltiel? Oh, poor Paltiel, right? Like, probably just some regular guy, probably some nobleman of some kind in Israel. And then he's just told, like, yeah, your wife is going back to, like, the king of Israel, to her first husband. So, yeah, you gotta say bye to her. And clearly he doesn't take it very well, right? He, like, follows her the whole way. He's crying the whole time, this poor guy. I feel bad for this guy, honestly. And, Paltiel is just, like, so sad that he's gonna lose his wife. Probably someone he really likes, right? Because obviously living with Michal all this time, he's obviously growing quite fond of her. But nope, all that gone just because David, wants another wife, right? After he has so many, and he has kids with all these women, right? So yeah, yeah, David is problematic, and we're only in chapter 2, right? Or chapter 3, sorry. So yeah, David. This is gonna land up some hot water later. That's all you need to know right now. But this scene does make David look like a really bad guy, right? Because, I mean, couldn't he have been content with the fact that he already had 6 wives? Which, by the way, he's already violating, like, parts of the law. But of course, like, God was willing to look the other way around it, I guess, because God wanted David to, like, rule Israel and do the whole purging of the Philistines kind of thing. So it's one of those weird things, and there'll be a part later in the Bible where God actually, like, basically more or less implied that he was willing to look the other way in regards to David's womanizing problems. Um, but here, it makes David look really, really bad. At least I mean, of course, this is us as moderns, but even within the context of the Bible itself, right? Where like, you know, shouldn't like marriage be limited to one man, one woman kind of thing, right? But David clearly has no regard for that because he's feeling that entitlement, right? That like, nah, man, like I'm awesome. I get to have all the women, right? Give me my harem, And of course, I know a lot of guys probably think like David is every man's dream, right? Because David actually does have a harem and can get away with it. But no, it's not the way to think. It's bad. Because you will see how this comes to bite David later. But as of here, David has like basically 7 wives. Now we know technically a couple of the women there are not his wives, they're concubines, but he had kids with them, so we're going to count them. And then finally, what else is there to say about chapter 3? There's not much, just about Abner's death. And of course David gets super mad at Joab, right? Because he's like, we could have had peace, man. You just couldn't like let that go, right? You couldn't just like let your brother's death go so that the people could have peace, right? But I mean, it depends on who you ask, but sometimes revenge is more important than peace. And it's one of those things that like, oh, here's your hot take of the week. We live in like, from what I've seen nowadays, we seem to be more like Joab as a society, right? Things like revenge are more important than the idea of peace, right? The idea of letting go of the past. Because of course, here's the thing too, right? When you think of something like the idea of peace, peace is very abstractal, right? The idea that like, okay, all of us are gonna live non-violently so we can be in good harmony with each other and let our society prosper. But when you think of something like that, it's very abstract, right? Like in the grand scheme of things, in that kind of world, you contribute very little, right? You're just part of the system, right? But of course, in 21st century, oh, don't be about the system, right? Do whatever you want, which gives people the idea that like they can be entitled to do whatever they want, and so it it's one of those funny things where like I don't know, from the way I see things, and I'm willing to be proven wrong if you think it's the case, but people are more interested in revenge more than they are about peace, right? And you think about like um, there was that whole thing in Canada. There's this whole thing in like can't remember where it was, like Kamloops basically, and there's a residential school there. If you don't know what that is, basically a residential school was a school, an indoctrination place basically of like changing the indigenous people from their culture into the Western culture, right? And then there was this whole thing about how like um, there was at this residential school there was like these 200 graves or whatever, and of course that's a terrible thing. It's a tragedy that stuff like that happens. But the real problem is how people dealt with the discovery, right? Because there were a lot of people who were going like, demanding. They were like, see, look at this injustice done to the indigenous people in like Kamloops or whatever, like in BC all those years ago, right? People have to pay for it today, right? The white man has to pay for it, right? But here's the problem with that mindset, right? First of all, the people who committed those atrocities are dead. They've been dead for years, right? So now I know some people think this is a weak reason to like, oh, this is another reason why people don't buy religion. But like, the hope in the grand scheme of things is that like, well, those people who did those atrocities will burn in hell where they belong, right? That's the hope of the afterlife. That God will, those of us that, God gives his favor to, we will be with him in paradise. And then there are those who do evil and they will burn, right? That's the hope of the afterlife, basically, right? Because we know in this world there's so much injustice, right? But you see a lot of these people, and there was like news reports and stuff, and people were like demanding, like, no, there should be reparations. Like, what about like today? Now some people would say like, okay, well, I'm a child of a survivor of the residential school, so it's not like it's history, which is true, but even with that being the case, you can't say like, oh, that means the 19-year-old white guy I work with should feel guilty about the residential school. You can't do that. That's wrong, because he's nothing. He has nothing to do with that, right? He's 19. What life has he lived so far, right? He's a kid, right? You're gonna charge someone for the sins of someone in the past, and you're only affiliated because of race. Like, that is, one, extremely racist, and two, that's just evil to punish people for things they don't do, right? A funny example, and the other funny thing about that, if my comic book reference for the week, because the nerds got to do that. Uh, that's also how you create supervillains, right? I mean, if you judge people like that, you think of like Bane from the Batman comics, right? Why do you think he's such a bad guy, right? It's because he was condemned like before he was born, because his dad was like a war criminal, right? And then of course naturally you made him into one. Wow, go figure, right? You charge people of crimes they don't commit, and then they end up committing them because they believe they're assigned to that fate, right? Bane in a nutshell. And so this idea of like the desire for revenge, it needs to stop, right? We Now, of course, there's the appeal to it. Now, going back to Joab, right? There's the appeal to revenge, right? Because if David and Abner succeeded in the peace treaty, well, where would Joab would feel like, well, where's my justice? What about Asahel, right? What about him, right? Now that he's dead, right? And Abner was the one who killed him. What about that, right? Will there be justice for that? But you have you have to look beyond, the now. And Joab fails to see that. And so David gets pretty mad because David was hoping to like build a better future, right? And it's kind of an interesting thing when you read this. And I thought about that thing, the Kamloops thing, and I know that was like weeks ago when they first brought it up, but I made these notes well beforehand. So, well, because remember I was supposed to read this last week, but I overslept last week. So I was actually supposed to read this last week. But anyway, there's that appeal to revenge, but at the same time, it's actually a really bad idea, right? Because you end up creating more victims, right? And then, of course, even the people who you want to have justice for. So, in the Bible's case, we're talking about Asahel, and modern day parallel. We can talk about these kids in Kamloops, right? We want to talk about real justice, Let's talk about like allowing people to live lives better, to make ourselves better people, as opposed to demanding reparations for the past, right? because you can't change the past. The past is the past, and it's kind of stuck that way, right? But you know what is more important, and you know, one of those things that many people forget that the Bible really cares a lot about is who are you today, right? How are you living your life today? Of course, the Bible also has that extra caveat of like, you know, do you believe in Jesus today, right? Because that's what the Bible's main question is. That's the ultimate question at the end of the day, is what the Bible basically asks, right? But it's not about did you believe in Jesus years ago, right? While that can have contribution to how your faith life today is good or, you know, improving, that's besides the point. But the idea is like, well, who are you today, right? And more importantly, are you a follower of Jesus today? That's kind of what the Bible's main question is, right? And that's supposed to be an idea that transfers to even secular culture, right? And one of the ironic things is that, like, well, secularism took this idea from the Christian idea, is that, like, well, it's about who I am today, right? I don't dwell on the past, right? And when bad things in the past come up, because they will come up, you can't escape them. If bad things have happened, if you've done bad things in the past, it will catch up to you. It's just the way it is. That's real life. But you don't shrink because of it, and it does, and you can't use that to lord it over other people, right? You can't just say that, well, you did this in the past, right? And that's another problem within like the extreme of cancel culture that has come today, right? Because of course, like the origins of it wanted to protect people, right? The idea of like, you think of stuff like Me Too, whatever, right? That's the kind of the origins of stuff like cancel culture. You know, when people have done bad things in the past, and especially in regard, well, see, when it comes to Me Too, it's very specific, right? It's like violence against women, and guys have done that in the past. Well, no shit, all guys, you know, do dumbass things to women because guys are idiots, right? But instead of thinking about like, well, how many men have grown out of that? How many men have become better, right? And what about the men fighting for, you know, the protection of women, right? And stuff like that. That was the right place. That was, you know, the heart was in the right place. But of course, cancel culture has kind of become ridiculous when it comes to like anything you said in the past can be used against you and can shut you down. Well, that's problematic because, you know, people change, right? And of course, hopefully for the better, because of course there's the opposite as well, right? There are people who were better in the past, and then they become pretty awful people today. But you judge them on who they are today, right? And so that's a that's an important thing to think about when we think about like when we read through this story about like Joab and his thirst for revenge and how dangerous that can be. And of course, you know, Joab will not be the only case where this is a real problem, right? Because minor spoilers, you know, this is one of David's shortcomings as a leader, is that since David tries to think too much of the big picture, he forgets to deal with the problems in the day, right? So I talked a bit about how like, okay, there are people who dwell too much on the past, right? And you should focus on what people are doing today. But at the same time, you can't be a person stuck in the future like David is. David's a bit of a futurist. And so, but David is too focused on thinking about the future of Israel, what's good for the kingdom in the future, that he fails to see today, right? Because, I mean, today is, in a lot of ways, today's the only day you really have, right? Because none of us are guaranteed tomorrow, right? And you can't change yesterday, right? And so, once again, the Christian principle is, well, do you believe God today? Do you trust in God today, right? Because you don't know if you have tomorrow to, you know, to do it, right? And of course, there's that whole like, I can't remember what show it's from, but you know, the idea of like the drunk dad and It's like, when are you going to stop drinking? Well, I can stop drinking at any time. Well, why don't you stop today? Well, I'll do it tomorrow, right? And of course, like, never happens, right? If you say, I'm going to do it tomorrow, you never know it's ever going to happen. So it ultimately comes down to, who are you today and how do you live today, right? And so this is one of the big problems that David and his leadership have, right? Is that they're too focused. They can't focus on the present, because some people are focused on the past, and some people like David are focused in the future. But no one ever focuses on the present, and that ends up getting you in hot water. Because then, of course, well, how do you deal with problems that come on that day, right? Of course, Jesus contrasts this, right? Where he says, tomorrow will bring its own worries, right? Why worry about tomorrow? Why worry about what you will eat or drink or what to wear, right? Tomorrow has its own worries, right? And so Jesus is reminding the people that, like, who you are today is what matters, right? And you continuously have to, act out faithfully in that, right? There's that funny scene in The Simpsons. I think I've referenced this scene before. There's a scene in The Simpsons. This is like an old episode, right? Back in the 90s, and there's this episode where Homer's like, he wants to do something. I can't remember exactly what it was. He wants to like drink this thing. He wants to like try this. Like, he's gonna mix his beer with something or whatever. And Marge tells him it's a terrible idea. Right? Like, don't do this. This is a really terrible idea. And Homer's response is great. He goes like, well, that's a problem for future Homer, right? And so the idea of, like, the genius behind that is that, like, well, yeah, Homer is correct that it's technically someone else's problem, because present Homer and future Homer are two very different people, right? And that's the other thing too when it comes to, like, how we live our lives today, right? It does matter, because when you have to deal with future you, well, future you is basically another person, right? So you should always be kind to other people, right? And you can't be self-serving in that way. Just like Joab here, right? His thirst for revenge is self-serving, as opposed to, like, the way we ought to live is for other people, right? And future you counts as the other person, right? Because he's not you. They're not you, right? Because you have no idea how much people will change, right? Including yourself. Anyway, that's a long tirade for chapter 3, because chapter 3 didn't have a lot to talk about, so. But I did want to have some content for chapter 3, because I was like, oh, it's just a bunch of events. Guy kills another guy, and that's it. But, well, it doesn't end there. Chapter 4. When Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, heard about Abner had died at Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Bana, and the other Rechab, and they were sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, from the tribe of Benjamin. Now Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin, because the people of Beeroth fled to Gittaim, and have resided there as foreigners to this day. Now Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. And his name was Mephibosheth. Now Rechab and Bana, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day. Now while he was taking his noonday rest, they went into the inner part of the house as if to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Bana slipped away. They had gone into the house while he was lying in the bed in his room. Now after they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head, and taking it with them, they traveled all night by the way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you. To this day, the Lord has avenged my lord, the king, against Saul and his offspring." Now David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, and someone told me, 'Saul is dead,' and thought he might be bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death at Ziklag." You can see where this is going. "That was the reward I gave him for his news. Now how much more, when wicked men have killed innocent blood in his own house and on his own bed, should I not demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. And they cut off their hands and feet and hung the bodies by the pool of Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. So chapter 4 is pretty short. So, there's this theme going on here in these 4 chapters. And that is, you be careful of the battles you pick and the people you kill, right? Because, you know, these guys that thought they were going to do David a service by killing Saul's family, or Saul himself, you might find yourself making more enemies than friends, right? If you're going around just killing people like this. And of course, you could say the opposite is true, because David's reaction is just to kill these guys, right? But the deceit of like the first guy, and of course the evil from these guys is to kill an innocent man, right? It's like only bad things can come from that, right? And sure, you know, this is where like Second Samuel is kind of all over the place sometimes, especially when you're reading it. This is why it's important that we take it step by step, right? To look at like, okay, so this is a moment where David's not so great, but here's a moment where he's a little bit more virtuous, and we have to go back and forth because, of course, one of the things to understand is that, well, one, David is just a person, right? Even with all his talent and skill, he's a person, you know, subject to things like being controlled by his lustful desires, or, you know, um, David being a futurist and not caring so much about the present. And, you know, you see like these elements of his personality, and so there's this. I know it seems a little conflicting, where it's like, okay, so what can we learn from David, and what is not a thing to, you know, to pick up from him, right? And so it's a lot of back and forth, but you know, when David has to do these kind of things, right? It's kind of this idea of, this is what the king life, the great leader life is like. It's not easy, and it's never meant to be easy. It's not meant to be in the hands of mortals. At least not, you know, the kingship to rule a people, right? And ultimately to rule humanity, right? Which, once again, you know, God is trying to give this idea, you know, the writer of Samuel is trying to give this idea that, well, only God can be king, because we see David here and he's kind of all over the place in his leadership, right? Trying to be king, right? And, you know, I give David a little bit of flack here and there for his failings, but I mean, we got to be a little bit compassionate, because he is only human, right? Because once again, the main theme of the book of Samuel is that only God can be king. Only God could truly lead. And so, we see David go back and forth here because, the pressures of the crown, they weigh heavy on him, right? And they weigh heavy on him pretty quickly, right? Like, sure, some time has passed. The Bible does do another little time jump. Of course, he had all those kids with all his wives then and stuff like that, right? But during that time, and from what we can gather, it's not that long. But the pressures of the crown, it really takes its toll, right? I mean, a good example to look at this as well is like U.S. presidents, right? Now, doesn't matter what side you lie on, but you look at these presidents, right? Whether they were good or bad, you know, not all that relevant. But, you look at them, and there's a reason to be extremely compassionate to more or less all of them, even if they're ones you don't like, because the the weight of that kind of leadership, right? Because a president is more or less like a king, right? The weight of that leadership is heavy, right? And I remember there was this old like meme thing about like when Barack Obama, former president, they had a picture of him when he started, and then they had a picture of him at the end of his 8 years, and holy moly, he looks terrible after the 8 years, right? He's gone completely gray, right? His posture's worse. He's a little decrepit looking, right? Because we can assume that like the stress of being the president, it takes its toll, and 8 years is like, I mean, sure, it's kind of long, but at the same time, it's not that long, right? But like 8 years, and former President Obama looks so different, and his body was pretty decrepit because of like all the stresses, I'm sure, of like being the president, right? And it's funny, one of those things where like, remember some people said like, well, Mike, you're good at communicating and stuff like that. Why don't you go for politics? I'm like, dude, man, like I would die, right? Because like that is a tall order, and people don't like. Sure, we can give shit to like politicians because of a lot of the bad things they do, but at the same time, we got to be like, lenient, because there's a lot of stress and pressure, right, that's put upon them. And you read David's life here in second Samuel, you see that, right? The pressure lays on pretty thick pretty quickly, right? There's all the more reason that like, you think of like in the book of Romans where Paul talks about like, we should respect authority, pray for leaders and whatever, right? There's a good reason for that, because like it's tough, right? And we see David here, it's tough. It's taken its toll on him pretty quickly. And he's only king of like the he's only king of the tribe of Judah, because he's not official king of like Israel yet, right? He's only like king of one of the like major clan groups. But then, we're going to read next week that David will become king of like the quote unquote unified Israel, because they're going to find a way to like make an agreement that he will be the official king of what is constituted as Israel, right? And so, that's only going to get crazier, right? Because if David's already like getting crushed by the pressure of the little bit that he has to govern, it's only going to get way worse when the workload gets that much heavier, right? And so that's definitely something to check out, which I will read that next week, because one, I feel like chapter 1 to 4 is a good enough place to stop. Secondly, for some reason I'm feeling really tired. I think I got like a second wind. I'm not feeling as like sleepy as I was like earlier in the stream. I think I got like a bit of a second wind, but I probably shouldn't push it, right? But anyway, that's going to be the end here. I think I've done enough reading. 4 chapters is a lot. So, Let's just do a bit of housekeeping, and then we're gonna end the stream. So first things first. Next week we're going back to the regular schedule. At least it should be. So that means more Monday and Monday and Wednesday we'll do Mario and Rabbids. I almost said like we'll do, Mario and Rabbids. We'll do Monday, Wednesday, or something. I was probably gonna say something like that. But so Monday and Wednesday we're gonna do Mario and Rabbids. Continue our playthrough in that. And then next Thursday we have a Throwback Thursday episode. And then of course next Friday we will continue on 2 Samuel starting with chapter 5 and move on from there. So that's basically how next week is going to look. It should be a regular schedule next week. Because of course this week was a little bit weird just because Canada Day was a thing, so we shifted a bit of like work schedule stuff, right? That's why I didn't stream on Wednesday, but streamed on Thursday instead. But next week we'll, go back to usual business. So that's basically it. I don't have much else to say. This is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed going through 2 Samuel. Thank you for being patient with me, because like you see I'm fading here and it's harder to maintain thought when you're like ready to just drop dead and sleep. So I don't know why I feel so tired, but I should probably go take a nap. But anyway, this is going to be the end. If you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys Monday for Mario and Rabbids. Or for those of you who are just here for reading, I'll see you guys next Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. Have a great Friday night. Have a great weekend. Independence Day for you Americans, because I think that's on Sunday. And God bless you.